Make sure you give it a quick minute for people to join the room before you start. I'll message you.
Yeah, just send me a text when it's happening. All right. Just got the notice that YouTube is live. Ben, are we ready to go? Yeah, I see Ray here. So we are definitely on with the webinar. Hello, everyone. And hi to Pastor Colby, who's here taking his time out of his day to speak to us on some pretty important topics. How are you?
Oh, that's a big question.
I know.
I'm right now in this moment, Adaline. I'm wonderful.
Fantastic.
I'm with you, and I'm going to be with some of your friends, and this is just the space that I love to be in. So I'm feeling good right now.
Absolutely. I know what you mean. It's like we kind of have to take those sweet moments as they come in the midst of the pandemic. But yeah, as I was talking to Colby really quickly before we came on, a little bit about our community and about how much his book has meant to all of you and the journey that we're on together, which we'll talk more about. I'm just going to read a quick introduction and then we'll get started. So Colby Martin is the pastor and author of The Shift, and the book we'll be discussing today, the LGBTQ Affirming Unclobber, Rethinking Our Misuse of the Bible on Homosexuality. There it is. Colby and his wife, Kate, co-founded and co-pastor at Sojourn Grace Collective in San Diego. Colby describes himself as a progressive Christian, which I'm excited to get into, and is passionate about carving out a space within Christianity that includes a wholeheartedly affirming posture towards the LGBTQ people, and a broader acceptance of other spiritual practices and religious perspectives, and agreeableness towards science, also good, and a commitment to growing, transforming, and trusting in the better days ahead. Well, that sounds refreshing.
That's a nice bio. Remind me to tip the person who wrote that for me.
Well, you know, I took a little bit from your website. I got to be honest. So thank you so much, Pastor Colby. And just to give you a sense of the people coming in today, this community is 99% queer. A couple allies right now. Of course, we're always open to more allies. And this group kind of started because I had a song on a LGBTQ television show called Winona Earp. And in the description of my YouTube video for the song, I talked a little bit about my journey, and your book was a part of that journey for me. Wow. And I just sort of started getting thousands of messages from people around the world saying, that's me. And it became very clear to me that we needed to address it in a way that we're doing right now. And obviously, as you can imagine, the biggest issue through all of this is a deep sense of loneliness, a sense of being completely alienated, and people just desperate to reconcile their faith and their sexuality. And we've all been here talking. It's about 2 months now that the community has started, and we do Zoom calls and discuss all of these things and really hear the stories of the people within the group of their trauma, and sometimes very heartbreaking trauma, and how a lot of them are coming to spirituality and reclaiming, as I like to say, their birthright, which is their spirituality. So I just yesterday actually heard from somebody reading the book who had a very similar reaction to me when I read it. Was I felt all of a sudden a freedom to be able to pick up my Bible again for the first time in a long time. And that sentiment has sort of echoed. And I mean, that's all the proof I need in general to know that this is big gift for people. It's a huge gift. And
can I just, okay. I didn't want to interrupt. I wanted you to get through all that, but I also don't want to lose that train of thought. So huge gift that people can pick up their Bible for the first time after, for very good reasons, leaving it on the shelf. And also I want to hold space for those for whom that still is not true. The Bible is still on the shelf, or maybe in the box at stuffed at Goodwill, or maybe all the way at Goodwill. That is for me, not only, how do I say this? Not only acceptable, that sounds a little bit patronizing, but that's okay. That's
Okay.
good. That's fine. If people never come back to the Bible again after it has been used as a weapon of shame and harm, from my perspective, that's all right.
Right.
Okay.
It's so amazing you say that, because part of what we're going to get into, we might as well just start with it really, is this idea of being a progressive Christian.
Sure.
And I feel like we probably have similar journeys in the sense that when something no longer feels proper, you talk about the tension between the head and the heart, or when there's trauma, sometimes it's not easy or right to go down the normal channels to sort of access God. So how would you describe progressive Christianity?
Yeah, what a great place to start. So you referenced this in the intro, but my second book just came out. Whoa. Okay, so I've got a green screen behind me, and I guess the color on here is green enough to where it's like translucent. So
that's pretty cool.
That's exciting. But it's called The Shift.
It's see-through.
It is surviving and thriving after moving from conservative to progressive Christianity. And in many ways, it's a survival guide for what do you do when you have either left your more conservative Christian world, faith community, and or been shown the door from it, or you just sort of realize the clothes of conservative Christianity don't really fit any longer. And yet you're still drawn to something in the Christian heritage and tradition, but you also have these instincts, this sense that it has to look and feel and be different than what it was. And so I call myself a progressive Christian, and I kind of put quotes around both of those because I guess they're the best way to describe, or they're the closest way to describe how I sort of move through the world. Neither one is exactly perfect. Like I'm sure, well, neither one is a monolith term anyway. So there are many progressives who would look at me and be like, no, you don't belong in our camp. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. And there are many Christians who would look at me and be like, you don't belong in our camp. I'm like, yeah, you're probably right. And that's okay. But I think those two terms for me, they at least get close to, so to put some sort of descriptor to it, Adaline, which is what the question was. And you're going to have to, every once in a while, stop me from going on, because my life motto is, why use 10 words when 50 will do? So
I'm the same. So we're in trouble, I think.
Okay. Yeah,
probably.
we're in trouble. But for me, a progressive Christian, there's 4 markers that I think, if you tick these markers, then you're going to find yourself on the more progressive spectrum. And it really is a spectrum. This is not a binary. This is not, there's a conservative and there's a progressive. No, we're told over and over again, these are binary options, but they're not. It's just a spectrum. It's just, so in America here, on the West Coast, the more West you get, which is where I'm at, the more you start to recognize different ways of talking and dressing and acting. You realize, okay, there's some familiar patterns there. And then if you go more East, similar to that. Now, there's no such thing as a West Coast person and an East Coast person, but you can imagine the closer you get to those coasts, you begin to notice some changes. So that's my spectrum, conservative, progressive. And I think my sense is that if a person is affirming of LGBTQ people, which is to say, yeah, you're a loved child of God just as you are. And yeah, if you want to be in a relationship with someone of the same sex, go, great. That's, open and affirming theology. That'll put you more towards the progressive end. 2, if you sort of have left behind this notion, and I laugh when I say it because it sounds so absurd now, but I lived it for years, that men are slightly better than women. So like 49%, men's the head of the house. Like if you just have gone, no, let's just, all people are equal, men, women, that's going to put you more in the progressive end of the spectrum.
Yep.
If you have an agreeableness towards science, which is to say, there's more things we can learn more about this world and ourselves outside of just this leather-bound ancient document. That's going to put you more towards the progressive end of the spectrum, which is fascinating to me. And then also, I think in this day and age, if you have an inner awareness that white supremacy is this toxin that needs to be unearthed, and you sort of begin to move yourself in that direction, then you're probably going to find yourself more in the progressive end of the spectrum. So that's kind of how I describe progressivism. And then Christian, honestly, Adaline, I've got the laziest definition of Christian, which is to say, if you are attempting to live your life in the way of Jesus.
I love that. This is such an important conversation, because as you know, so many people turn from faith because it doesn't make sense for them in their, like you said, you say those internal convictions. For me personally, I struggled with the concept of hell. I still do. I had to rethink that. I had to give myself permission to go in and rethink what made sense for me. And that's not something you're encouraged to do. So really, people fall through the cracks all the time because the tension between the head and the heart, or the idea that there is this very, very one way to God, and losing all nuance of abuse, of trauma, and the fact that people's lives are messy. They don't get to live in perfect boxes that raise the most perfect situation for them. Those people need a place to go. And it sounds like what your church is a place for those kinds of people.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. I would say our biggest front door at the church, which right now doesn't exist because it's virtual, but our biggest front door receives those who are looking for a soft place to land after having found the sharp edge of church.
Let's talk a bit about that sharp edge, specifically in terms of the LGBTQ community. So one thing that I listened to a lot of debates, and I actually caught your recent debate that you did. I find debate really fascinating. I listen to Unbelievable a lot, Justin Brierley's podcast. Yeah. Love it. And I think these podcasts where you're dealing with top thinkers really show you those shades of gray that I craved when I, was going through my own, faith crises. But I do feel, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, that with the non-affirming arguments, sure, they can win in a debate. They can win in a debate format, as anything can win. You see people talk about creation, and someone debating an atheist. There's always a winner. How do you apply a non-affirming position pastorally? Can you even do that? Because obviously the non-affirming positions, the idea that, conversion therapy obviously is failed. We have tons of people in our group that have gone through that painful process. We also know that telling people that, that they're given this gift of celibacy when it doesn't feel like a gift. I know it is a gift for some people, but it isn't for everybody. To play devil's advocate, how do you see a pastoral application towards these people that doesn't make them feel really triggered, especially even the most soft one, which would be love the sinner, hate the sin, which is still very troubling for people in our group?
Yeah.
To me, that's where it breaks down. I don't know how you apply it to people's lives.
So what I can do in this with that question is I can rather successfully put myself in the shoes of a non-affirming pastor.
Right.
And describe how I could still shepherd people with tenderness and care while holding a non-affirming position.
Right.
I could describe that, which I think is what you're asking, and I can unpack that in a minute. But
there are people in this group that have that. So, yeah.
But that has a real thin veneer to it, which is to say, I can describe the pastor who is in their world and in their experience being shepherding and pastorally, but the intent of that pastoralness and the impact of how it actually lands on the person that said pastor thinks they're pastoring is oftentimes very, very different. So my point is, from the direction of the non-affirming pastor, I think there can be the idea and the intent and the expectation that I am loving this person.
Agree.
I am showing them love. I think on the other side, though, we need to be able to name that this is not love. This is not love as it is understood and defined by people like Bell Hooks and M. Scott Peck. This is not love.
Well, there are conditions to the love.
Well, there are conditions to the love, and it is, it just, love needs to, in some ways, feel like love. So the whole concept of tough love, I'm not entirely sure is a philosophy that I even agree with. It sounds I don't know. I think we're talking about something else when we talk about tough love. But I think to your point, sure, a non-affirming pastor, they have the conviction that God has somewhere filed away in, I guess, heaven, wherever God lives. Sorry for the eye roll there.
It's okay.
God is not a being that just has a house somewhere in some heaven somewhere. Like once we created telescopes, we realized, oh, there's no heaven up there. So anyways, but the non-affirming assumption is that God has a divine document hidden away somewhere in God's office, and on it are all of these laws and expectations and rules on how humans can behave that God's kind of stuck with. Like maybe God wrote it a long time ago, and now God's like, ah, crap. Like I wish I could update that. I wish I could do like amendments to the Constitution, but I'm kind of stuck with that. Oh well. And God is sort of beholden to this, and then as pastors, we are then beholden to that divine expectation. So the only time that in our mind God is happy with us as pastors is when we are moving people to alignment with this expectation. And that God actually gets angry or wrathful or vengeful when we fail to meet those expectations, which is about the least parenting. It's about the least like a parent I've ever heard, by the way. And yet Jesus most related to God as parent.
Yeah.
If you, even as wicked children, when your child asks you for a piece of bread, don't give him a stone. If at least you know how to treat your child with kindness, how much more your Father in heaven.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting. When I talked to my father's a pastor. And when I spoke to him, he has a PhD in theology. He's a wonderful man, very much on this journey with me, trying to figure this all out. But specifically, when I first started broaching the concept of hell, that was one thing that I just thought, my father loves me so much. And he, claims to believe that Jesus, God, loves me more. So that's where things start to get tricky with all of this. Is I personally don't think it's very easy to go to this place that we talk of. And I think that fear is very prevalent in this group. We talk a lot about, we talk a lot about hell, and a lot of their families very much still adhere to this idea. And I'd love to talk a little bit more before we go into some of the clobber passages of this idea of sin, missing the mark. And I think in general, one of the arguments I find compelling about the affirming position is just the fact that, like you said, God doesn't have this document that he's checking, but he does insert into us discernment. He does give us instincts. And I do think that for us as a group, to see the healing that's happened in the group, to see the fruits of the Spirit, as we often say, the families that are being raised, the little kids running around, the joy and the freedom that people are feeling, we all know what sin feels like. We do. And for the LGBT community, it doesn't feel like sin. So to me, that's where this gets really tough. So what would you say to people that are, that feel that they're not sinning, but still have that conditioning that they're going someplace terrible?
Yeah, sin is a fascinating world, isn't it?
Yes.
It has a ton of baggage and expectation and weight around it that between you and me, Adaline, and who are watching and are going to listen later, that baggage and weight does not belong on this idea of sin.
Agreed.
So here, I'll try to give you the quick Reader's Digest take on sin, but I do have a TED talk right now out on the YouTubes that I unpack sin a little bit more, which, yes, I did a TED talk on sin. How fun is that?
I love that.
And so sin, you mentioned this, it comes from this Greek word hamartia, which means to miss the mark. What's fascinating about this word, Adaline, is that in its original usage of hamartia, the idea is that a person missed the mark, not because they were bad or did something wrong, but they missed the mark because they didn't know any better. They had gaps in their knowledge. And so the idea is, if you imagine someone, because it comes from the archer world, if you imagine somebody arrow and missing the mark repeatedly, it's hamartia if their missing of the mark is a result of the fact that you could imagine maybe nobody ever taught them how to properly notch an arrow, or how to pull back the string right, or how to pace their breathing. And so they're missing the mark out of gaps in their knowledge, is how Aristotle talked about it, gaps in their knowledge. So Eckhart Tolle talks sin as ignorance. So we commit these errors when we don't know any better.
Yes.
Not because we're bad people. And the most famous example of this in Greek in Greek tragedy plays is the story of Oedipus. And Oedipus, if your viewers or listeners remember, Oedipus is the story of the guy who didn't realize that his dad was king and his mom was queen, so he killed the king on accident, which was his dad. Then he married the queen on it, which was his mom. And it's a story of this sort of unfolding all this. It's like the perfect example of hamartia. And Oedipus's hamartia, it's not that he killed a guy or practiced incest. His hamartia was that he didn't know who he was. He didn't know who he was, Adaline. He didn't know his own identity, which was, I'm a child of the king and I'm a child of the queen. And as a result, from this place of ignorance, he caused harm to others and to himself. Okay, so why is that important? Because now when we talk about sin in the Christian tradition has come to mean this, these egregious acts that we commit because we're wicked, immoral, fallen people.
Yeah. It's very behavior-based.
It's very behavior-based, and it's very shame-based, and it's very punishment-based. Whereas
totally
hamartia in ancient Greece, hamartia, if someone committed hamartia, the response to that person was compassion. It was compassion because, oh, you didn't know any better. Well, here, let me show you how to properly notch an arrow. Let me show you how to properly pace your breathing so that when you shoot your next arrow, it will fly more true. If we could find a way, but I do need to asterisk and say we need to come back to homosexuality as sin, because we need to just talk about that separately. But sin in general as a term, if we can realize that this is not a place for judgment, as sin is not a time for judgment, sin is a time for compassion, that when we hurt ourselves and hurt other people, it's from a place of ignorance, that we don't often know who we are, which is a loved child of God. And when we're rooted and grounded in that as what is most real, our arrows fly so much more true.
I agree with you. I think that, obviously there's this concept of judgment, and that's this idea that God judges. And I think it's just in that sort of knowledge of Christianity, that sort of tradition, that's where it gets a little bit tricky, because I think that the judgment piece isn't supposed to be a shame-based device. That's right. And somehow it has become that. So what would you say about in the reference or in the context of the LGBTQ issue with the idea of sin?
Well, so here I did a little series on my Instagram a couple of weeks ago that I think really struck a chord with people. But the somewhat people think is a simple question is, or the question of, is homosexuality a sin?
Yeah.
I find to be, all apologies to anyone who might think this, a really dumb question. It's a really absurd question. And the way you can know it's absurd is if you just for a second swap out homosexuality with heterosexuality, and then listen to how this question sounds. Is heterosexuality a sin?
Right.
And instantly you're like, well, I mean, heterosexuality just means like people are attracted to people of the opposite sex. And I guess sometimes sex in that context is sinful and sometimes not. And all of a sudden the person is forced to recognize that there's nuance, there's depth, there's follow-up questions, that to just ask, is a particular sexual orientation as defined in the 1970s or whatever it was, is a particular sexual orientation a sin, is just sort of a nonsensical question. It doesn't make sense to begin with. If you want to talk about, not you personally, but the person asking the hypothetical question, if you want to talk about our same-sex sex acts a sin,
right?
Cool. Let's talk about that. And let's
the actions.
The same conclusion of sometimes yes, sometimes no. Just like how we have for us non-queer folk. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sure. Let's just apply the same standards to everybody. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of this childlike innocence that you experienced with Carol the lesbian in the hot tub. Like, there is something to be said. I think that children even know the essence of right or wrong. Dogs sometimes know when they're wrong. There's this thing, when something is wrong. And I think for you, that is so powerful, because for you, she was just a woman. Yeah. And then all of a sudden this meaning got inserted that even at the time felt troubling to you. Even as a child, it felt troubling. So tell us a little bit about that sort of reconciling that you came to with the head and the heart.
Yeah, so Adaline's referencing the opening line of my book, chapter 1. As all good stories do, mine begins in a lesbian's hot tub. That's how the book begins.
No one here is going to not say that's accurate.
Yeah, no one's going to deny the reality of that. So well done, all you lesbians. Yeah, so I was born and raised in a conservative Baptist home, and ended up going to college at a conservative Baptist college. So my entire upbringing and into education and early ministry was all in the framework of conservative Baptist evangelical theology, which, as it relates to the topic of sexuality, just took what you could call the traditional opinion, what we might now call the non-affirming position. And so that was, I don't really ever remember talking about it growing up. Don't remember Sunday school classes or sermons about it. It was just sort of this if and when it ever came up in the cultural milieu, then it was just sort of the assumption, oh yeah, that's wrong. That's not God's design.
Same.
But I tell the story of how it was a woman who lived across the street from us named Carol, that used to invite me and my brothers over to enjoy her hot tub and drink some iced tea and lemonade. And it wasn't until, I don't know, several iterations of down in the hot tub later that my mom was like, oh yeah, by the way, Carol was my teacher in high school and she's a lesbian. And she just sort of said it nonchalant, even though I know that in her mind, she would have followed it up theologically and she's a sinner for it, but she never said that per se. So it was just sort of this weird, this odd misalignment of realities that sort of sat with me for years growing up. The church sort of tells me these are depraved sinners, but Carol was really nice. I don't know. She just treated me nice. I had a paper route and she always paid her bill on time and often tipped me. So well done, lesbians. You're representing humanity really well.
Oh my gosh, they're loving you right now. Well, absolutely. You're saying all the right things.
And so it wasn't until I had graduated college and was working at my first job, full-time ministry at a church as a worship and arts pastor. And I was studying to go through the licensing process. And I read in the manual that the denomination does not allow practicing homosexuals, which is always the oddest term. Like, at what point, Adaline, do you stop becoming practicing and you're just a professional at it? Like, at what point are you just good?
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing I was saying earlier, where it's like practicing as in like you can't do anything ever, and that's just your gift.
Yes.
So it's your gift. Anyways, go on.
Well done. And I just remember having this moment of this like record scratch moment where my head was sort of firmly rooted in this theological position of, like, homosexuality is not God's design. And of course, same-sex marriages are a thing.
Right.
And yet then I'm reading, but they can't be members in the church and they can't serve like in children's ministry or be pastors. And I just remember this moment of, this doesn't feel right.
Yeah.
I get it. My head's over here. Sure, I can argue and defend it. But my heart is like, what is this? How are we, even if it is a sin, as I would have said back then, like, why are we treating people this way?
Yeah, at the very least that.
Yeah. So that was the first seeds of tension for me, and this misalignment between my head and my heart, that it took me a couple then years later to finally chase that rabbit down and be like, all right, Colby, you need to actually figure out what you think about this.
Absolutely.
It is time to have, what is that verse that often gets thrown at people? Like Paul says, always be prepared in season and out for the reasons that you have. I'm like, I don't have a reason for this. I just am parroting what I remember youth group teachers teaching me. So let's study these things.
But this is one of the biggest frustrations, Colby, for the LGBTQ community, is if you've come to a non-affirming position because you've researched it and you've read queer theology and you've done a very careful examination of both sides, then go at it, believe what you want to believe. But the truth is that for a lot of people, for most people, they don't know these arguments.
Yeah,
they don't know the arguments in your book. And that's where it becomes problematic. And I think that's where it becomes offensive for people.
Man, I only laugh because I just suddenly felt a little bit of that in these last few weeks. And I don't mean to get political, so I'm going to dip my toe in and then I'm going to pull right back out. We don't need to go down this rabbit hole at all. But I just remember the week after the election here in America, the number of people that were accepting these ideas that the election was rigged and a fraud, and the stories that they would use as evidence or proof, it took 20 seconds of Googling that story to find out that it was completely not true or not real. And I just remember, like, after a week of chasing down just about 7 or 8 of these, I'm like so infuriated that people are like willfully ignorant. Their laziness and willful ignorance. They don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know the truth. So that little bit of just me for a week being inflamed at this, as soon as you said that about how it must feel for queer people to know that, especially if they're close to like family or friends, and they have never done anything more than just Google, is homosexuality a sin? Google search number 1 Corinthians 6:9, thou shalt not inherit the kingdom of God, practice homo. Oh, well, it's pretty clear. It's right there. So I guess I'm good. I've got the Bible on my side. That just must be not just infuriating, but hurtful, layers upon layers. So to know that people can't even be bothered to look deeper than a freaking Google search.
Absolutely. And the thing is, I mean, even with the political side, one could argue that it's hard to know truth right now with, the media and all the things happening. But that is when discernment comes in. And I think that in order to know truth, you have to be willing to be open to that voice of discernment. There are plenty of people in this group whose families will not consider even broaching the topic. A lot of don't ask, don't tell, funny enough, which is part of the reason that your career as in that church started to kind of get unsteady because of your decision that was discriminatory. And I really think that, and I do want to dive into some of the scriptures, but I just also want to say, as far as your journey goes, and we had a book club last night and discussed this a bit. Your sort of conversation about coming out of this theological closet was really powerful for a lot of us. I know in no way you're not trying to appropriate what it feels like to come out as far as being gay, but I do think that for those of us from this background, we know how hard it is to stand up, and as a straight cis man, that is huge. And I think that some people could probably target you and say that you took an easy way out by sort of adopting maybe a more secular attitude towards these things. But I know enough, coming from the same background as you, to know that this is actually the hardest thing you can do. You alienated all your friends and family. You lost your mentor. You lost your job. So do you feel like that experience gave you that sort of extra understanding of what it might feel like to come out as gay? That feeling of losing the people around you?
Yes. And I know that it still pales in comparison.
Right.
So it's the both hand of it.
We appreciate that. That's amazing.
Yeah. So I am grateful for, the work of empathy, and this is relatively new to me in the last 5 or 6 years, because I'm not a naturally empathetic, and I've had to actually study what empathy is and practice it. But the work of empathy is to really attempt to hear another person's pain, and then in your own sort of database of experiences, find something similar to enough to where you can overlay them to be like, oh, if this was hard for me here, and it's a little bit like what you're saying, then suddenly I can actually now be able to in some way put myself in your shoes and understand the pain. Like, this is the work of empathy. So we actually do need, in these conversations, and we do need to have some touch points in that to really understand empathy, knowing that it's just going to be a slight Venn diagram overlap. It's not not a full-on mapping. So to your point, yes, I do feel that in my own way, having this story, this experience of being fired for my theology on sexuality, and at a time in my life losing virtually everything.
Yes.
That gives some touch point to me of what that must be like to have someone come out of the closet and to lose. So I
you do,
I
but your language your language, Colby. I mean, this is the thing, is that we talked about this last night, and we acknowledge that you did that, and we value it. And I think like some of the language you said, like you're saying your desire to be seen left you feeling invisible. I mean, that is how people feel, this desire to be seen. All of a sudden people don't see you, but that you also had to do it because you know that true community can't happen until you're seen. And there's so many people in this group that haven't come out yet. And we've actually had 4 people come out in the last 6 weeks, just from the support of this group. And I think, it makes me so excited because regardless of your theology, it is important for people to not live in secrecy. It is not healthy. No. You cannot claim to be a Christian and think that people should live that way. You agree?
100%.
Yeah.
You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Absolutely.
This is not a theological, this is not like you shall know the correct beliefs and that shall set you free. This is not what's at stake here. This is not a truth. Jesus was not some sort of like professional doctrine teacher. He didn't even teach sorry, I'm gonna get fired up here in a minute. He didn't even teach doctrine. Like belief didn't matter to Jesus. I don't know how else to say this to people. It's part of what I focus so much on in this translucent book, The Shift, is that belief doesn't freaking matter. It doesn't matters insofar as belief leads to action, and action matters, but belief by itself doesn't. Jesus doesn't care what you think. This is really what I think. Jesus didn't care what people believed about him. He didn't care what people believed about him. Think about it. He taught in parables. The most obscure, like pedagogical, I always struggle on that word, pedagogical process that he could think of parables is what it was his primary teaching method, which are meant to confuse, meant to cause people to sit with and wrestle with things. If doctrine mattered to Jesus, if belief mattered to God, then Jesus would have just been like, all right, everybody sit down. I'm going to give you all the right answers so that you know when you get to the final test, you can pass it. No, it's not about belief. Jesus didn't care that you believed in him. He cared that you believed him. And what is the difference there? The difference is believing Jesus when he says things like, mercy is better than sacrifice. Love your enemies and bless those who curse you. Forgive those who've hurt you 70 times, 7 times. Like believe that the way of Jesus is what leads to this abundant, wholehearted, flourishing life. That's the truth that sets you free. And when people are forced to divide themselves, when people are forced to live in secrecy and in shame, when people are forced to live in celibacy, which, by the way, Adaline, is the least godly thing that I can think of. Go back to the original Jewish story of how the world was created. Everything that God creates is good. Sun, good. Moon, good. Stars, good. Plants, buffalo, fish, good, good, good. When does the goodness stop? The goodness stops when God creates one human and is like, crap, the human's alone. This is not good. This is when the flow of goodness stops. It's like the only thing that can mess up a good universe is when humans are forced to be alone.
Absolutely. And I agree with all of that. Oh, preach, Pastor Colby. And honestly, the way I feel about it too is specifically, if we're going to like focus in on Jesus right now, someone I know, when I mentioned that I was LGBTQ affirming before I even had my own journey of realization about my sexuality, people were like, well, what does Jesus say? Well, nothing. Jesus didn't say anything about this. And in fact, you talk a little bit about eunuchs in the book and how if there was going to be sort of like this idea of someone who was same-sex attracted naturally, that it would probably be in that sphere. And Jesus could have absolutely made a point of mentioning it. I know we're talking about historical context and maybe it didn't make sense at the time, but if this was going to be the dividing issue that ruined the church seriously and caused people to kill themselves, I think that maybe he would have mentioned it. And I think that that's what's confusing is people don't even know that Jesus didn't say anything. Again, ignorance, laziness, and sloppy thinking.
Yeah.
I'm getting my holy rage right now.
Let's do it.
We talked about it. So let's dive in a little bit because I don't want to take up too much of your time. So just so everyone does know, Colby has provided sort of these cheat sheets for the book. I encourage you to get it, like a lot of you have. Support him and his billion children, his 4 kids.
Feels like a billion someday.
A lot of children. Buy the book. But also, if you want to, you can download these cheat sheets, which are just like little, easy sort of bits. But really read the book to get into the nitty gritty of it. But let's just go through a couple of these. maybe specifically on some things that hit me is really interesting. So obviously Genesis 1, and Colby, I'm exactly like you. For the most long time of my life, I thought of it as this like scary group of gay men. And that was the story for me. And that was the messaging. And obviously, like you say in this, that it's a much bigger story. But I think the irony that we find in the group, and this is probably the most easy to kind of wrap your head around Unclobber passage, I think, for people. But for us, it was really fascinating that the story of sort of like this person showing kindness to outsiders it's ironic that the story of
it's super ironic.
How
it's
ironic is that?
Ironic.
It's kind of sad.
It's a story that was meant to be a guidepost for Israel for generations to come, to be like, oh, you know what matters is treating outsiders with kindness and care and respect. That's what matters. And then it became this sodomite, became this term to label this entire group of people that now are outsiders and others, and we just marginalize them. Just ugh.
It's pretty intense. And I think so also sad. Like what we've been talking about too is that we've really seen a massive difference in culture as far as mental health and understanding afflictions and understanding why people do things. And I think we have a greater understanding now of rape and how in general rape, 100% of the time is about power. Not about pleasure. And so for me, when I was reading that as a child, I wouldn't come at that scripture the same way. Now I would go, well, this isn't spelling out or sounding like a sensual moment of group sex. Yeah. This is violent. Yeah. And violence is very rarely associated with pleasure like that. So
yeah, this story has nothing to do with sexual orientation and has nothing to do with individuals who are in a same-sex relationship of equals and love and respect and mutual care. It's just to those two questions, this story is entirely irrelevant. It has nothing to do with it.
Right.
Yeah. So, and what's been nice is that over the last, I want to say 5 or 10 years, more and more non-affirming theologians and scholars have stopped pointing to this. Like it's become pretty painfully clear across the board. Now that hasn't trickled down to pastors. Unfortunately, a lot of pastors and a lot of churches, they get their training from their college and their seminary, and then they kind of just stay frozen in that. So even though you have a lot of work being done to be like, let's quit using Sodom and Gomorrah as biblical proof to justify our discrimination. Unfortunately, that just the word hasn't gotten out.
Why is that? Why is that, Colby? Why is it that, I can listen to an incredible podcast like Unbelievable and get fed and go, yes, like those are the questions burning inside me. And that those of us can see the Pope condoning civil union of people of the same sex. And yet the body cannot get there. Is it laziness? What is it?
Here's what so this goes back to when I was trying to put some descriptors around this term progressive Christian. I left one of them out, and it's one that's kind of more, I don't know if it's the overlying umbrella or if it's the underlying foundation. I mix my metaphors constantly. It's one of my favorite things to do in life is just use new metaphors all the time. But one of the things that makes progressives progressive, and this is not just in the religious world or political world, this is just of the 5 big characteristic personality traits. One of the characteristics is openness. And how high you score on openness will be a pretty strong predictor on where you end up leaning politically and religiously. So if you score high on openness, then you have an openness to new ideas and new information. And people who score really low on openness, you get value judgment here. It's just one of the 5 big traits. They tend to be less open towards new things, new ideas. So when you map that onto the sort of conservative versus the fundamental posture of someone who's conservative is that we have already sort of figured out what is true. So let's lock it down and let's conserve that. Let's preserve that. The truth has already been revealed. So in the Christian world, the assumption is that the truth has already been revealed, specially revealed through these inspired writers of the Bible that are giving us this inerrant and infallible book. And so we have the truth. All we need to do now is lock it down and preserve it. higher you score in openness, you tend to be more open to new ideas, which allows you to get curious about things and challenge and question. And so those who find themselves moving more progressive, whether again politically or religiously, they will have this sense that, you know what, maybe there's more we can learn out there.
Yeah.
Maybe there's things that I don't know yet. Maybe there's better arguments or better ideas. So to your question, why is it that so many pastors are still over here? It's because the fundamental assumption is we've already been given what is true, and there's no reason to really do new research or update our thinking. We already know the truth. We have the Nicene Creed. All we got to do is just stick with that and we're good. So,
well, and it's true. And you know, what's happening too, is that nobody's life is messy yet, because every time in life that people have had to move is when their kid comes home and says, I'm gay. Then you are forced to look those things in the face. And it's not just that issue. People that have kids that end up having drug problems, alcohol problems, you now have a reason to look at things with compassion. But of course, the whole glass house perspective is sometimes very hard for people to realize that nuance is everything. And it's important for us. Anyways, I love that. Let's move on really quickly to Leviticus. So much fun. On to Leviticus, everyone. Leviticus 18 and 20. So this is the section that talks about you shall not lie with a man as with a woman is an abomination. And you really get into the idea of abomination, which is
why do we need to talk about this? Didn't you say 99% of these are lesbians?
Okay.
So this is just about dudes not doing with dudes. Moving on. Lesbians, you're good.
Moving on. Okay, well, let's talk about that for a second.
But no, that is an important point, isn't it? Like, if
I mean, but they wouldn't write to women then, right?
Oh, sure. Sure. There's all sorts of prohibitions in Leviticus that regulate a woman's body. Yeah, they weren't against. Yeah, right. We've come so far. Yeah. They weren't against writing things about what women could and couldn't do. Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, it is for me a not a small point to say, right. If, again, I sort of frame it like this: if the purpose here of this newly liberated people group, that's the context of Leviticus, is it's this book written by the tribe of Levites, which some scholars suggest it's just for the tribe of Levi, because it kind of says that at the beginning of the book, for the tribe of Levi. But anyway, the tribe of Levites are trying to figure out, how do we organize ourselves in a type of way that shows the world that we follow Yahweh, which at that time was just the God that they followed amongst many gods. This is one thing that I think many people don't realize, is that the ancient Israelites were polytheistic like everybody else. It just was a polytheistic world. So Yahweh was the God. You shall have no other gods before me. The assumption is that there's other gods, but Yahweh shall be the most high. They call him the most high God. That's why when Moses, the burning bush, he's like, who and who should I tell him sent me? Like, which of the gods is this here?
Right.
So they were originally a polytheistic tribe, and they eventually sort of grew into monotheism, singular God. But so the Israelite people, after having just been freed out of Egypt and on their way to the promised land, we're trying to figure out, how do we organize ourselves in such a way that is different from the Egyptians, different from the Canaanites, and reflects to the world who Yahweh is. And so this is what Leviticus is all about: how to do their rituals and do their religious ceremonies and organize themselves, how to relate to each other. And if one of the important things to them was to prohibit any and all same-sex sexual activity, whether it's between men and men or any women and women, if that was their goal, then these verses in Leviticus simply do not accomplish that. There's either less or more that could and should have been said. So these are naming something very specific. And in the book, I talk about what that might actually be. Very specific. And it's putting a prohibition around that. And even then, that prohibition is sort of limited to this, period of time in this group of people, but only not about orientation and not about two people of the same sex who are in a mutually respecting, loving relationship.
Right. And none of these verses address that. And in fact, I would say the overarching theme going into Romans and going into all the other scriptures would be this idea that it seems to be pointing towards exploitive sex. in every single instance. And we'll get there in a second, but it does feel like there just wasn't language to describe what we have happening in culture right now in a loving, committed relationship with people having beautiful children who they love. So we'll move on. Or
not have children. You can do whatever you life.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's
you were going to mention Tova. I think did you want to talk about Tova for a second?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that quick.
Okay. So Tova is the Hebrew word, and I don't know that I'm saying it right. Honestly, one time I gave a presentation on this, and someone came up to me afterwards, and they're like, "You're saying that word wrong."
I was like, "Toiva" or "Tova."
Like, I don't know.
It's fine.
I really don't care. I don't think it delegitimizes my argument.
No.
But the Hebrew word Tova is the word that has been translated into English by English translators as abomination, and I think that translation is an abomination because I don't think Tova at all means what abomination means in English. So synonyms for abomination, Adaline, in English are vile, gross, and subhuman. This is what abomination means.
This is why we have such a disgust.
Yeah, I can feel like the angst of the people who are watching and listening later. Like, you've had this word thrown at you, whether directly or indirectly. You are an abomination. That to even have feelings and attractions for someone of the same sex will then categorically create in you this label of abomination, which is going to make you feel vile, gross, and subhuman, because that's what this word means. But this is not what Tova means. This is not what the Hebrew is saying. The word Tova was a specific noun that talked about the state that one would be in if they did actions that violated the cultural customs of their culture. This is not about morality, which isn't to say that some Tova actions weren't immoral. Yeah, don't sacrifice your children to Molech. Got it. We can agree that that is both Tova and probably crosses some serious moral guidelines. But just because something is called Tova, my point is, just because something's called Tova does not mean it's wicked, immoral, and sinful.
Right, which is why we see those verses that we've let go of, the mixed fabrics, the shellfish.
Yeah. Like, it's those things were the things you just named were behaviors that were indicative of life in Egypt, from which they were just liberated from, and Canaan, to which they were going. And so again, you imagine the Israelites in their mind, we got to figure out how to be set apart, which is the layman's way of saying holy. We got to figure out how to live holy. So to do things differently. We can't do things that blur the boundaries between us and these other cultures.
Right.
And so Tova was used. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and those acts aren't necessarily the acts that we have today. And I noticed, you have that one, when you talk about this, you have this idea of mankind laying with woman wife. And some people in the group were wondering, do you think it's possible in that it was pointing more to like this idea of like an infidelity potentially? Like that might be what it is.
I think it's absolutely possible because the Hebrew would, so the English is, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. And in the book, I talk about how the term male was just the generic mankind, womankind, but then the term for woman was the specific singular, like woman, but it's also the same word translated as wife. So there's no reason necessarily. And because all of chapter 18 of Leviticus, the whole damn thing, sorry, I don't know if you got to tag this now. The whole darn thing is about, I should have asked you that beforehand, Adaline, what's the rating here?
Not at all, it's fine.
The whole thing in chapter 18 is prohibitions against different incest relationships.
Yes.
Don't have sex with your grandmother, your aunt, your like all your sister's sister. All of it was like in the context of family. So it actually would make a lot of contextual sense to say you shall not lie with a male as with your wife or as with a wife. So anyway, there's whatever specific prohibition that the author or authors of Leviticus were naming there. It was a specific prohibition against a particular act within a particular context, not the same thing as a universal prohibition against any and all same-sex acts for the Israelites.
Right. And a very, very long time ago.
And a very, very long time ago.
And
we maybe give ourselves some credit for, as human species, that maybe we have come a ways in terms of understanding some things, that maybe we shouldn't take all of our cues for what's most moral from these ancient books. Like,
yes, especially when it's causing the head-heart problem.
Yeah.
Especially.
If it's not leading to good fruit, get rid of it.
Yes, when it's leading to death in this group.
More. Hey, Jesus, what's the most important thing? Love God, love yourself, love your neighbor.
That's it.
That's it.
And thank you for coming today. No, I'm just kidding. No, it's perfect. Let's keep on really quickly here. So Romans 1, obviously the trickiest one, but also the one I found the most fascinating. This whole setting the trap. And I thought it was really cool. I actually didn't know much about this before I read your book, and obviously it's not necessarily as spelled out. It takes an understanding of that and a trust that potentially that could be what's happening based on your own experience and your own feeling that you feel that God is good with who you are. But I do think it's really fascinating, this idea of this language being un-Pauline and how it seems to be referencing, very well-known documents, texts at the time, like the Wisdom of Solomon, and how potentially, and this is one thing that I feel though, in general, people agree on. It has always seemed weird to have this list and then all of a sudden people stop there because the next part is so clearly the most important part for Paul, which is the idea of no, you are not clear of your own sin. And it's so people stop so early. There's no context. Everything's lost in translation. So what got you there to sort of see it this way?
What got me there was the work of Douglas Campbell, whose book, The Deliverance of God, opened up for me. And to be honest, I don't know where Douglas falls in terms of affirming or non-affirming. He was just doing study of Romans in general and showing how in these opening chapters of Paul, there are layers of things going on that to the casual English reader we're not going to pick up on. And yet to the first century readers in Rome would have been as clear as day. I'm trying to think like today, what an example would be is if you were texting with a group of friends and you didn't bother using quote marks because the Greek didn't even have quote marks. So just imagine you weren't even using quote marks and you didn't cite a source, but you just dropped in like the lyrics to a Taylor Swift song.
Totally.
Like, shake it off, shake it off. Like
right.
We would know, oh, you're quoting this is not Adaline telling her friends to like do some sort of movement with their body to cause things to fall to the ground. This is not what's happening here. She's quoting something that sort of everybody knows what's going on. This is what is happening in the opening chapter of Romans, where this 15 verse chunk between verse 18 and 32, so the second half of chapter, and the clobber passages are verses 26 and 27. They're nestled inside this 15 verse. I call it a discourse. This is like imagine it as a standalone piece of literature that Paul may or may not have actually even written. There's actually good reason to think that because it's so, as you said, un-Pauline in its construction, it might even just been like a copy and paste sort of thing where Paul grabbed these ideas, this sort of argument that sort of maps the plight of the Gentiles, that they turned away from the Creator, they worshipped the created, God gave them over, and so they received the due penalty of their error. This is kind of the narrative arc of this chunk in Romans, which is also the identical narrative arc to, as you said, this widely circulated piece of Jewish literature. You might even call it Jewish propaganda literature called the Wisdom of Solomon, which every good Jew knew about. And part of the Wisdom of Solomon, the point was to reinforce this narrative that God has chosen the Jewish people and not the Gentiles. How do we know this? Because the Gentiles have turned away from God. They have worshiped the Creator instead of the created. God has given them over to their issues and they've received the due penalty of their error. Paul uses this same argument, the same judgmental posture to privilege the Jews over the Gentiles, drops it in this opening letter of Romans. And Adaline, like said, if we don't keep reading, not only do we not get to chapter 2, where Paul sort of flips the script and says, oh, yeah. By the way, if you just agreed with everything I said, you're the problem.
Yeah.
Like that's the problem. That judgmental attitude, that's the thing that works against the gospel. Not only do you not get that if you stop reading, if you don't read the whole book of Romans, then you miss the point that the whole point of this letter is to unify these two groups together, the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. And one more thing, and then I'll take a breath. If you don't know about the context of Rome in this time, The whole context of the city of Rome is that just recently the Jews had finally returned back to the city after being exiled from the Emperor Claudius in 49 AD for causing all sorts of chaos. So the Jews were completely removed from the picture for about half a decade, leaving just Gentile Christians, and the Jews came back into. So now you had this already sort of contentious relationship in this newly formed church in Rome between Jews and Gentiles. They weren't getting along. Paul writes them a letter, says, y'all, this experiment of church, like, we have to figure this out. I don't know if this is going to work to put Jews and Gentiles together, but we got to figure this stuff out. So you have to figure out how to live in harmony with each other. You have to figure out, some of you eat meat, some of you don't. Get along. Some of you worship on some days, some of you don't. Get along. The whole point is to get these two together. And so this opening move in Romans is to bring to the surface the Jewish prejudices against the Gentiles, flip the trap and say, all right, now all of that prejudice, all of that judgment, it has to stop. This is the thing that's going to undo this whole experiment. So this actual clobber passage, really, to talk about the irony that we talked about in Genesis, the irony is that this was originally a passage used to unify and bring together groups that had been fractured. And now we've used it to drive this massive wedge between people who identify queer and not.
And it's interesting. It's amazing. It's interesting because oftentimes I think liberal Christians or progressive Christians often get kind of criticized for cherry picking verses. But this is such a classic example of that happening the other way around, where it's like, well, we're going to pick this, but we're not going to place it in any historical context. We're not going to read past it. And we're just going to focus on this word homosexual that is, 200 years old?
Yeah.
And let's talk about that for a second. How annoying is that? That there's one word to describe 7 different words that were used in the original Hebrew.
Yeah. Yeah, that word I think you're referring to shows up in the last 2 clobber passages in Corinthians and Timothy, because it's not in Romans. But where I thought you were going to go is, not only do they cherry pick and ignore the context, but even their cherry picking is wrong, because like, what does Paul write? That they abandon natural relations for those that are unnatural.
Yes.
Y'all, you can't just read the English and be like, unnatural. I bet that means gay sex.
Yeah.
This is not what it means to go against nature. This is not what parakousis, the Greek contrary to nature, means. Contrary to nature in that context, when it's about sex, all that meant was sex that could not lead to procreation. Any sex act that was not procreative was parakousis, contrary to nature. In fact,
that totally makes sense.
Sure, yeah. A couple hundred years later, Augustine writes and he says, so this is my paraphrase. I don't know if he talked like this, but so sex with a prostitute, it's not moral, it's not good, but it's at least cataphusis. It's at least according to nature, because it could lead to a baby. So parakousis, contrary to nature, just means any sex act that was not procreative in nature. So this very well could have been a husband and wife engaging in anal sex.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, it could have been oral sex. That's parakousis.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean gay sex.
Absolutely. And that is so easy for me to wrap my head around. And then of course, these other 2 ones, the shameless acts, the dishonorable passions. You know, you were talking a little bit obviously about how, again, this tends to point towards exploitive or pagan worship rituals.
Yeah. Or just anything, or something that violated Jewish culture.
Yeah.
It goes back to the Leviticus passage, where we're talking about a violation of cultural boundaries that doesn't transcend all of time and all of space. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
We don't have to be beholden to a particular custom, whether it's this or others from 2,000 years ago. We just
Absolutely. And that kind of leads us lastly to the 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. And again, just to touch on it quickly, it does seem in these passages, again, we just have words that people don't know, maybe pointing towards, pederasty, the slave rape, which to me, it's funny because when I read this list of people that don't inherit the kingdom of God, it makes a whole lot more sense to kind of be like murderers, people that these awful people, and, people who are raping, people who are exploiting or, engaging in maybe like exploitive or unconsensual sex, that makes sense to me. But, this idea of murderers and, families with beautiful children, it's like, So why don't you tell us a little bit more of those final 2 terms?
Yeah, I like that last point. Murderers versus people that are raising well-adjusted humans and living, like, that's another thing you do, to go back to Romans just for a second, is if you read that whole 15 verse passage, you get a real bad taste in your mouth of people that have really just gone off the rails. And what commonality does that have to my friends Rachel and Vanessa, or Josh and Ted, or Matthew and Christopher? Nothing. No, it doesn't. It's not their life at all. And yet there is this sort of assumption that to be gay will just lead you down a road of depravity where you're nothing but a slime ball. I don't know. It's just
a slime ball. Exploiting and asserting power over people. Yeah, no, 100%. That's why it's like, sometimes you need to read those scriptures with that in mind. When you, instead of putting the word homosexual, put in your friend's name. Yeah. See if it makes sense. I doubt it will. I doubt it will.
Yeah.
These
last two passages, they share the same words. So I kind of treat them as one. But especially in 1 Corinthians 6:9, Paul, and I try to make a larger argument in here that I won't get into, but again, I mentioned it a little bit with the Romans thing, where Paul is planting these churches really as experiments to see if this sort of this new social community in the way of Jesus is going to work out. There's no guarantee that he or anybody could get Jews and Gentiles to live together. And also, there was a belief that Jesus was going to bodily return like within a couple years. So there was like a sense of urgency to it. You feel this in Paul's writing a lot. Like, Jesus could come at any time, like a thief in the night. He could return. So be ready, be prepared. And so there was this sense of urgency that people really would get their stuff together, figure out how to live together in harmony and peace with one another, live in such a way that the larger culture is like, man, there's something different about this group that embodies this compassionate forgiveness, grace, love for enemy, like this whole way of Jesus thing. It really was supposed to be different. And so Paul oftentimes had this sense of, he would write a whole letter, for instance, and call out one person. Like, this is what 1 Corinthians chapter 5, right before the Unclobber passage, he's like, there's this one guy that's sleeping with his stepmom. Like, and Paul just is incensed about this. Are you kidding me? Why are you putting up with this? If this guy isn't going to quit sleeping with his stepmom, then kick him out of the group. Don't eat with him. I'm serious. Don't eat with him. And you can hear in Paul, sure, one take on that is this super judgmental jerk, maybe. Another sense is like, he's so like big picture focused. Like, Jesus could come at any time, guys, and we sort of need this thing to be ready for him when he does, that he has this sense of urgency to him. And so this is where this Unclobber passage shows up in, where Paul just kind of lists off a number of different things that all strike Paul as being incompatible with people who are going to inherit the kingdom of God. When Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, for Jesus, it was about the kingdom within. It was about experiencing the divine here and now. For most, or maybe all of his followers, they thought kingdom was a thing that was going to like happen tangibly in earth, like with military rulers and all of that. And even Paul had that sort of sense of like, Jesus is going to come back and set up the kingdom. So get everything figured out. And you can't be like you said, you can't be a murderer. You can't be a liar. You can't be greedy. You can't be sexually immoral. Like, we've got to clean up all of this, especially in Corinth. This would have been like the hotbed. This was the Vegas of Vegases in the ancient world. And so Paul really had this massive sense of urgency to him. And you can feel that in his writing, especially in this passage. So I think part of us needs to just step back and be like, I bet if Paul give him a couple more years and a few more deep breaths, and he probably, like, I don't know that he would have written the same thing the same way.
Right. Again, the cultural context, the context is so important.
Yeah. And yet we have been told that the Bible is inerrant, inspired, fallible document, as though the Holy Spirit just sort of took over human meat puppets to write these words down, and they are timeless truths forever and ever, as opposed to anchored into a contextual moment in history, a real human author written to real human communities.
And you can do that without invalidating the scriptures. And I mean, we can't get into all of this because we don't have time, but I know you talk a lot about the times the church has gotten it wrong.
Yeah.
This is not this first time. Let's have like a bit of a bit of faith to know that maybe, or a little humility to go, okay, this doesn't seem to be making sense. Let's figure out why. But you're right. It's like, you don't have to throw out the baby in the bathwater with the bathwater. You can root this in a historical sense and still try to find out if it makes sense for us
Absolutely.
in the century we're in.
Yeah. And I just to go back one more time to the translucent book, The Shift. Ooh, if I turn it that way a little bit, you can kind of see the cover.
Now it looks like it's fully a book.
Yeah. I have a whole chapter in there. So the 4 chapters deal with theological issues when you move from conservative to progressive Christianity. God, Jesus, Bible, and church. And so the chapter on the Bible really does look at it and be like, all right, we can't hold on to inerrancy of Scripture. It doesn't hold water. The idea of the Scripture being inerrant is that it's without error, except it does have errors.
Yeah.
It contradicts
already proven.
Constantly, already proven. So we can let go of that. We can let go of the infallibility of Scripture, which is to say that the Bible will not lead you astray. Well, actually, the Bible's led a lot of people to a lot of strays. So we can let go of the infallible. But the idea of the Bible still being inspired, actually, I still buy into that. I might define inspiration slightly different than the meat puppet idea. But yeah, like you're saying, we don't got to throw the whole thing out. Like the fact that this collection of stories and poems and letters has made it through 3,000 years of human culture, that's incredible. These are some hard-earned truths about what it means to be alive, about how to relate to each other, how to relate to ourselves, how to understand the divine. Like, I don't think the truths found in these dusty old books should be easily cast aside, even if many of them do need updated, amended, edited, or just redacted out because they no longer belong. Yeah.
And I think that if it's truly inspired book means that someone who does not have any kind of training in how it should be interpreted could potentially pick it up and still be left with how it's supposed to be read and how it's supposed to feel based on intuition. I think that sometimes when you're trained to read it a certain way, it then becomes so triggering to even pick it up. But if you could almost look at it with fresh eyes, when I was in university, I had friends that had never read it and they were reading through it and they were like, actually, this is pretty cool. And I was like, I'll never have that experience. And so there are a lot of people in this group that I know want to pick it back up. So it's about sort of knowing that there are truths there that just doesn't have to be interpreted the way that you grew up believing it.
Yeah, I love that, Adaline. And I think my word of encouragement, just to echo that, is if people want to pick it back up, which again, I said at the very top, you don't have to, certainly not in any rush. But if you want to, one of the ways that I have found people can find that sense of freedom is to reimagine for themselves what it means to not only have faith, but to be accepted by God, and to detach all of that from correct belief. Know, trust, and believe that correct belief is not the point, and that the point of the Bible is not to read it, understand it, learn it, and know it, and to get the right answers, because that's so much freaking pressure. But rather, what if you just read it and let it read you, like any other piece of art? Not what does this mean? You don't go to a museum and look at a painting on the wall and be like, what does it mean? Rather, you're like, what is this doing inside of me? This is how we sort of engage with art. And I think this is how we can engage with the Bible, is like, what is this story doing in me? What is this letter doing in me? And that can give people sort of new sets of eyes to kind of come to these things, not as a textbook to study and understand, although there's a time and place for that, but more as this hard-earned human wisdom that has deep, profound meaning. And
absolutely. And if this is an inspired book, then God doesn't need our help. God doesn't need our help in order to get people to understand this. If it is truly inspired, then it will read you, as you just said, which I think is a beautiful way. And I can see in the chat, people are loving that. Pastor Colby, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I want to, if we can, just quickly touch on the last two terms. And then I want to ask you one final question, specifically as a pastor. I think I want to end this speaking to you as a pastor and some of the issues in the group, and just get a bit of your pastoral sense, your pastoral advice on some of this. The last two, 1 Corinthians, 1 Timothy, just to summarize that, I guess you would just say more examples of terms being sort of combined to mean one thing with homosexuality.
I don't, it's understandable that translators throughout the years have struggled to know what to do, especially with 1 Corinthians 6:9, because Paul uses two Greek words there, malakoi, which we know malakoi just means soft. usually used to describe fabrics, soft fabrics, but oftentimes used to describe a person's sort of disposition. Maybe they're spineless, so they're weak-willed in that way. And then pejoratively, malakoi was used to describe the partner in a sexual encounter who was on the receiving end, the passive partner, if you would, and ways that had these echoes of this sort of patriarchal.
Yes.
To be womanly was to be less than.
Yes.
And so to be malakoi, to be soft, was sort of a put down in that way. And so malakoi, like the King James, I think translates it as effeminate. Okay, whatever. Not a word, but they were trying to name sort of the passive partner in a sexual encounter. And then the second word is arsenokoitai, which is a word that really nobody knows exactly what it means, because it might have even been a word that Paul created.
Right.
It's certainly the earliest use in Greek of this term. We see it come after that, and it's really just the squeezing together of two Greek words, arsen, which is man, and koitai, which is bed. So it's just like bed, man's. And so translators have tried to, understand more. And what seems clear to me is that Paul is naming two roles in a sexual encounter: the passive malakoi and the arsenokoitai. And all these are also, he has in mind, two men. So these are two men in a sexual encounter. But again, this is not the thing. I was talking about a person's sexual orientation, which, by the way, some translations like the New American Standard do translate arsenic. They combine these two words to just the English term homosexuals, which talks about a person's identity, which is really tragic. That you could imagine somebody maybe at a young age taking a Bible off their shelf and opening it up. I don't know why a young child is reading a Bible, but maybe they're just curious. They come to 1 Corinthians 6:9 and they read this translation that says, homosexuals shall not inherit the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Which is to tell that little person that, oh, you mean just having these desires for the other boys in my class? That's makes me incompatible with the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Like, what a god awful, I literally mean god awful translation, to make it about a person's identity. And then translations do some version of behavior or action: men who practice homosexuality, or the New King James, abusers of themselves with mankind. Whew, that's a mouthful. Whatever it means.
Right.
But Adaline, I think you mentioned this earlier, and I'll just say this in conclusion. I believe what Paul was naming were two men, or just men in general, that are engaged in sexual activity that is either exploitive in nature, where there's an imbalance of power and one person is using the other person, or where there's an economic transaction going on. And this could be prostitution. And we see this just, again, in the context of the words themselves, in the letter as a whole, how later usage of this term shows up. Is Paul talking about orientation? No. Is Paul envisioning two people of the same sex in a mutual, loving, committed relationship? No. For Paul, there was always an imbalance somewhere or some sort of transaction. And so Paul says, yeah, let's not do that with this community that we're building. And I want to apply it. Colby, want to apply that straight, gay, queer, bi, all. Like, let's just all agree to not exploit ourselves or each other, and to not treat other people as property or ourselves as property. Like, let's just all agree to that. Let's not have some expectations for straight folk and others for queer folk. No.
It goes both ways. And just like that, you unclobbered it. Just like that. Obviously, everyone, this gets so much more in depth in the book. And again, pick it up. This has been incredible. I do want to just ask you a final kind of pastoral question. Like I said, I talked last night with the group, and there are a lot of people feeling, a lot of people tackling shame. A lot of people in the eye of the storm in these very conservative states and conservative homes whose families will refuse to listen, whose families condemn them, and they're trying to find forgiveness and being shamed constantly. We have people on the journey that have been out for years but still struggle with that shame. What do you want to say to the queer people in this group who are struggling with those things right now?
Right at the very top, and I wrote this note down right at the very top, Adaline, use the phrase reconcile our faith and sexuality. And I wrote that down because it struck me as you shouldn't have to reconcile those.
Agreed.
You should not have to. Those are never meant to be apart.
It's a tragedy.
It's a tragedy. And I am so sorry for those who are watching and listening that you have had to endure family systems, family members, churches, religious systems tell you that those two things are not compatible. And that now you have to go through this work of reconciling those. It's exhausting, and I'm sorry. And I'm super proud of you because you're doing it. You're here. You're doing the work. And for those of you who have had years or maybe decades of these messages, that you're an abomination or that you need to be celibate, please hear me when I say, and this is my armchair psychologist speaking, please hear me when I say it's going to take a while for those messages to go away. And that's not your fault. It's not your fault. It wasn't your fault that you got the messages in the first place. Nobody chooses who they're born to. Nobody chooses when they're born. Nobody chooses the culture, the context. You were just born. You didn't have any say in what religion you were raised in. You didn't have any say in who your parents were. Your parents might be lovely, but they didn't have any say in how they were raised. We're all given these contexts in which we have to sort of find ourselves and wake up to reality and existence. And it's just not your fault. It's not your fault that you were told these messages, but these messages were buried deep into you, so deep that you don't even know how to separate the truth that 2 + 2 = 4 with being gay sin. Your brain picked up these messages at the same exact time in your life. And how is it to know that one is sort of mathematically backed and one is just a cultural narrative that can and should be discarded at some point? Your brain doesn't know. It's going to take a while. My therapist talks about this as being recording the old tapes with new tapes. There's a lot of old tapes of shame. There's a lot of old tapes of shame. There's a lot of old tapes of shame. It's going to take a while. Of course it is. These tapes, they weren't your fault. They're there. I'm sorry. You're doing the hard work to get new tapes. It's going to take a while. Try not to, my friend. Try not to add increased weight and shame on yourself, that when you fall back into these stories and you feel that, oh crap, what if, please try not to add more of beating yourself up for that, because it's going to take a while for these messages to be rooted out, if they ever can fully. And I have dear friends who have been out and married and raising families for decades who still find these old tapes popping up now and again. And it sucks. It absolutely, it's not fair. You don't deserve it. You didn't deserve it. But maybe we can take some solace. I'm reminded again to go back to the Apostle Paul, who pleaded with the Lord 3 times, which honestly, between you and me, isn't that many times. I'm sure many of you have pleaded a hell of a lot more than 3. Pleaded with the Lord 3 times to take some thorn in his flesh away, something that was eating at him constantly, something that was preventing him from fully whatever it was, this thorn in his side. He pleaded and God never took it away, is how Paul described it. But Paul realized something. He said, actually, what this has helped me come to see is that in my weakness is when I am most complete. Some translations go strong, when I'm strong in my weakness. That word can also be complete. I am whole. It's almost as if that weakness of yours, those old tapes, this struggle, this whole process is part of what makes you whole. It's part of what brings you to a flourishing life. How wild is that?
I love that. Oh my gosh, everyone's crying. Everyone's crying. No, it's interesting because I agree with you. I often say to everybody that when you are tested, your faith can only grow. And when people have this journey, they are forced to dig in deep. They're forced to know why they believe what they believe. They're forced to have a deeper sense of truth and a deeper sense of understanding than people that don't have to ever look at themselves in the mirror and have those hard conversations. So I do agree with you. I think that as hard as the journey is, it is enriching in the sense that we grow to much deeper depths as human beings, having to embrace these struggles. So thank you so much, Pastor Colby, for coming here. And just quickly, I'm sure there are people who would be interested in joining you in your church. It's online, I'm assuming, right now. So for those of you listening that want to potentially join Pastor Colby and his church online, I will post all the details so you can go get connected there if that's something that you want to do. Perfect. Well, thanks again, everyone, for this time. And Pastor Colby, thank you again for being such an important part of my own journey as well.
I'm just honored, absolutely honored. I can't even, to think that anything that I've done in the world has had an impact, and it's just a gift. So I'm so glad. Thanks.
I'm so glad too. Okay, perfect. Bye, everyone. I will see you back online.